Hello, hi everyone. Today we will continue. For the Certified Kubernetes Administrator question bank, next we are on question 5. Question 5 is about, which is our load balancing service. Previously, actually, we've already done one, right? We already did one earlier. I have done something like this. I have done an ingress. If it's a service, what is the main difference between them? For ingress, our main focus is on URL related things, which means it's definitely at layer 7. At layer 7, we have domain names, and with domain names, it involves layer 7 operations. Additionally, for service, it's at layer 4. Service can only operate at layer 4, which means it can do load balancing and proxying through IP and port numbers, but it can't add domain names. So when we were working with ingress before, it actually called service inside. I'm not sure if you all remember. We called it 4S before. That was in the ingress exercise. Let's see where the service information is. Here, do you see it? It uses service on port 8080. Then go as this backend service for us, essentially. It's basically just calling service directly as the backend service. As for our own approach to service, we're only just starting here. The order of things, well, it's not really important, not important at all. Also, what we just did has nothing to do with this. There's no connection whatsoever. We're not even on the same host. So, as I mentioned earlier, in this case, in the CKA certification for the 16 questions, there's basically no connection between each one. Because each question has its own independent environment, there's absolutely no connection between them. So if you want to stop halfway through, you can just close it. It doesn't matter. Next time, you don't have to start all over again, right? You can just pick whichever question you want to do, like playing Gamito, whichever one you feel like. You just remotely connect to the corresponding topic and start working on it right away. This is actually a pretty convenient feature. You can practice whichever question you want. And since some questions are simple and some are complex, right? For example, the 4th question we just did is actually one of the simpler ones among the ones we've covered so far. So when you come across these simple questions, just practice them a few times until you're familiar with them. After that, you basically don't need to practice them much anymore. You just need to take out the questions you're not very comfortable with and practice those repeatedly. In the end, make sure you're proficient with everything overall, right? You should be able to finish within an hour and a half. Try to be as fast as possible. If you have quick hands and can finish in an hour, that would be ideal. Nothing could be better than that. In this case, you'll have plenty of time during the exam, right? So if any unexpected errors pop up, you'll have time to troubleshoot, right? Or if things lag a bit, you can afford to wait a little, right? The faster you type, the more room for error you have. But if, say, it takes you 2 hours to finish typing, that's actually quite risky. What could happen then? You might not be able to finish in time. This does happen. A lot of students have experienced this before. When you're working on it, if you haven't practiced enough and aren't very proficient, you might end up not finishing the problems. This does happen. So you need to pay attention here. What's important? You have to be fast. You really need to pick up the pace. Since each problem is independent, if there's a particular question you're not familiar with, just focus on that one and practice it a few more times. Actually, you don't even need to type it out too many times, right? 10 times at most if you type out a problem 10 times and you're still not proficient. Then just do it another 10 times and another 10 times after that if needed. That's the key point to keep in mind. Now, as for this SWICE's question, it's unrelated to the previous ones. So just work on it separately. You don't need to worry about the earlier problems. Even the port numbers are different. You can see that in the second ingress question earlier, the port used was 8080, right? For this problem, we're required to use port 80. Is there any connection between the two? There's absolutely no connection. If there were, they would have had you do the SWICE question before the ingress one. But since there's no relation, the ingress question comes first. It doesn't affect anything. All right, next, let's take a look at the specific solution for this SWICE problem. First, let's look at the requirements for this part. What it actually wants us to do is configure something specifically to configure an existing one in the current namespace. Note it's an existing deployment. Then we need to expose port 80 from our container by creating a new resource to make the port accessible. Port 80 is exposed using a service, making port 80 accessible. Normally, our ports can't be accessed from outside. Whether it's a service or ingress, their main function is essentially to provide something like port mapping, exposing the port for you, and performing load balancing. That's the main purpose of these two services. Now, let's configure it here. Note that this time, we need to set up a new service. We're going to use Notepad mode to expose the port. Here, you need to pay extra attention to the hint at the end of each question. For example, what was the hint for the previous question? The last question told us not to do something. Modify any existing content, right? The hint for this question is to create a new service. Pay attention to this point, be extra careful to avoid making any accidental mistakes, right? always check the requirements before you start. So make sure you understand the requirements before you begin. During practice, everyone should try to focus on the basic requirements of each question, right? Its basic elements. The format, as well as some fundamental methods for making changes. Summarize these frequently, and also make sure to understand the meanings behind it. Once you become proficient through practice, right, then you'll be like a fish in water. So next, let's move on. First, let's take a look at this question. It asks us to create a new node that is a newswise. But before creating it, we need to first modify the configuration of the existing deployment and then deal with the Swice issue. So first, let's open up the terminal. Let's start with that. Let's modify the contents of the deployment. All right. First, we'll use the kubectl command to edit. What are we editing? We're going to edit our existing development information. Here, what we're editing is the existing one, which is called this name. You just need to auto-complete it. In fact, you don't even need to type any letters here, because in this environment, there's only this one. Deployment, did you see that? After I typed deployment, it auto-completed right away. What does that mean? It means that in this environment, there's actually only this one. Since there's only this one, we can just go ahead and edit it directly. So after coming in, what exactly do we need to change? As for the requirements in the question, what is the main point? The main thing is about the port number issue, right? It requires that our port number must be correct. As for the other content, honestly, there's basically nothing else to worry about. Also, if you make a mistake the first time you modify this file, because what we're changing this time isn't actually the real file, it's a temporary one, temporary configuration file. If you make a mistake while editing, for example, even if you just get a space wrong usually, when you try to save the first time, it will give you an error. If you try to save a second time, it will roll back the changes and exit. If you get an error the first time you save, you can check where you went wrong, fix it, and then try saving and exiting again. If you don't see any error and you press :WQ twice, it doesn't matter. Either it will just roll back and exit after the second attempt. It won't save any incorrect COI content. So this way of making changes is actually relatively safe because the service is running right now. We don't know exactly what's happening in real time. So you can't just make changes recklessly. If you make a mistake somewhere, right, it will also check your syntax. And only if the syntax is correct can the modification go through. Now, let's find our container. Here it is. All right, our container is this one. This is the container. We found what's inside the container, right? The image has already been specified, hasn't it? The image garbage collection policy has a name as well. So what do we do here? We just need to add something at a port number. Because here, it actually doesn't even have a port specified. In this case, if you don't specify port, even Swice can't help you map it. So first, you need to make sure your container exposes a port. Then, we can map the port of your container to the outside, right? This is the most basic step. You first need to make sure your container has a port so that Swice can help you map this port out. So here, we need to add our ports. To add it, basically, you just need to specify the port and the protocol here. There's nothing else to it. We just specify which port to use, since the requirement is for port 80, right? Okay, so we'll set it to port 80. And as for the protocol, of course, it's TCP, since most of our services use the TCP protocol. So here, let's save it. All right, after saving, as long as there are no errors, it means your syntax is correct and the changes have taken effect, right? The modification is done. Next, what can we do? We can go ahead and configure the second set of information. The first part is already set up, right? Our deployment modification is okay. As long as you make sure port 80 is exposed, our service can help map this port 80 outwards, perform load balancing, and enable things like proxying. That's the only way it'll work. If your container doesn't have a port, your service won't be accessible at all. If your service can't be accessed, nothing else will work. All right, next, let's take a look. Let's go ahead and configure this. Swice, right? What we require here is Swice. Okay, so what about Swiss? In this case, the question usually provides you with one method, just one way to create it. Sometimes it might be a file, sometimes it's a command. Usually they'll let you choose a method that's relatively simpler and a bit faster. So which method should we use? Well, creating this service with a command is going to be faster. The configuration is relatively simple. Of course, if you want to use a file, that's also fine. If your fundamentals are solid, then whether you use a file or a command, it really doesn't make much difference for you. You can use whichever method you prefer. So here, we'll use the command. It's relatively simpler and a bit faster. Of course, if you want to use a file, that's perfectly fine too. If you want to use a file, just follow the way we wrote it before, right? Start from the API version, then metadata, and then SPC. Just make sure you include all 4 parts. So if you're not very familiar with this yet, if you're still not very skilled, just follow the instructions in the question for now. The question bank usually gives you some simpler methods to choose from. So next, we'll use the command to create it. We'll use a command for this. When creating it with a command, the first thing we need to pay attention to is the requirements in the question are about the port number and also the type of port exposure method. For example, a notepad port number is 80. There are also requirements for our service name, right? These are our basic 1, 2, 3. With these 3 requirements plus specifying the deployment, that's 4 in total, right? So there are 4 requirements. First, we need to make sure our service is connected to the deployment we just created. That's the first requirement. The second is to specify the mode. The third is to specify port 80. And the fourth is to specify the name, which is the name of our service. So there are 4 requirements in total. So we can just include these 4 requirements in a single command. First, let's use the control command to create it. Of course, the very first step ideally is to use njust and a lot. Well, here it depends. But the most recommended way is to write it at the beginning or at the end. Either way is fine. If you write it at the end, actually it looks pretty good too, right? Writing it at the end actually looks quite nice and a bit more organized, but it's not practical. Putting the namespace at the end is not practical at all. Sure, it looks nice, but that's useless. It doesn't serve any purpose. Because if you write it at the end, you can't use a type key for auto-completion in many cases. Of course, it's not always the case, but in many situations, why is that? Because we have many namespaces in our project, and if you don't restrict the namespace, then some of your configurations later on will be... It's not convenient for auto-completion, because you might have this configuration in many different places. Of course, some global resources are exceptions, those don't really matter, you can just auto-complete them directly. But for most resources, they're actually local resources, meaning they're within a specific namespace. So when it comes to most resources, for example, if I don't write the N option first this time, right? If I try to write deployment first, is that okay? You can see here that when I press the tab key, it doesn't auto-complete. There is no response. I pressed the type key and there was no response at all. Why is this happening? It's because by default, we have a namespace, but when there are no resources in this default namespace, the tab key can't auto-complete anything. So what's the benefit of first setting up a namespace? Once you've created this namespace, right, then when you add the resources you want later, as long as they're in this namespace, you can auto-complete directly. For example, let's expose a port, say port 80, right? We expose port 80 and use a certain mode. And here we need to connect to a... You see, here you can auto-complete, right? Of course, strictly speaking, this isn't really considered a resource. It's not a complete resource. And here we use this. Did you all see that? See, now it can be auto-completed, right? Just now, when we typed it directly, nothing showed up, right? But now, as soon as I start typing, it appears immediately. So what is this? This is the advantage of our autocomplete feature. The benefit of putting the manifest file at the front is that you can autocomplete anything you want later on. As long as it's in the manifest file, you can use the config file to autocomplete it directly. In fact, even in some cases, like the environments and the questions from our question bank, they are all like this. In an environment, there are usually only 1 or 2 resources. So there are very few resources, which makes it very convenient to add or supplement them. It's really easy to add them in. And here, the type we specify is, first of all, set to notepad. The port number behind is equal to port 80. As for the outgoing port, what do we use? We also use port 80. After writing the port, finally, we specify our slice. And here, of course, to be precise, well, more precisely, as you might expect. And as is evident, what we are creating here is in fact referred to as, in the question, it's called its name, right? Okay, let's write down the name. All right. After we create it, we specify and set up this twice. Once it's created, how do we verify it? First of all, there are no errors, right? If there are no errors, it means our format is correct. Next, let's check the current information of the slice. As before, what do we write first? First, we write the namespace, then check the slice. Since there's only one slice, as you can see when I type slice here, it can be auto-completed directly. For detailed information, we use OY to view it. All right. First, let's check the name over here. The 3 words are combined correctly, no problem. The type is fine. Notepad IP, don't worry about the IP. That's not something we set. Next, the port number. Okay, port 80 is being used. This port is also a random port, so you don't need to worry about it. Farther down, the age of 32 seconds, just created, that's fine. Finally, the labels are all correct. So that's our process check. Each line, according to the requirements of the task. If this whole line is fine, then there shouldn't be any issues. Of course, there's also another way to access it. You can also try this. So how do you access it? Well, since there's an IP here, right? With the IP, you can try accessing it. What we're accessing is this. This one. Let's write down this IP and see what happens. The port is 80, right? Since the port is 80, we don't need to change ITADI. It's the default. So we can see, hey, it's this hello world again. There was a previous question with this as well, right? The result is the same. So this is basically our situation here. What does this question mainly test? It checks this part here, and as long as the result below can display normally, that's enough. The requirement is just that it displays correctly. So this is our basic situation. Some students might have questions like, what is this tag at the end? It's our previous resource. For deployment, don't we need to connect to the service, right? How do we connect? Through labels. These labels are here. In this file, in the deployment file, they are present. The labels are in this file. If you forget, you can take another look. It's right here. The label, right? Like app equals prompt end. See here? If the labels match, it means the service and the deployment can be connected, right? They can be connected. Of course, as long as you can access it from here, it means it's working. Why? Because if you can't access it, if they're not connected, then you wouldn't be able to access the pods from here. You wouldn't be able to access the information inside the container. If you can access it here, it means the connection was definitely successful. All right, this is our 5th question about the configuration of the service. If you need the complete question bank, you can leave a comment below and get it at the best price. The most reliable question bank. So that's it for today. Goodbye, everyone.